Welcome to Dreamy Tales, a place where gentle, relaxing stories will guide you into a deep sleep. On this channel, we'll be sharing soothing stories to help you unwind and forget the worries of the day. If you enjoy these peaceful moments, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you won't miss any of our bedtime tales. Let's create a space of relaxation together each night. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, let's take a few moments to relax your body and mind. Find a comfortable spot to sit or lie down. Gently close your eyes and take a deep breath. Inhale slowly, feeling the fresh air filling your lungs, and slowly exhale, letting the tension in your body gradually melt away. Repeat this 3 more times. With each breath, feel yourself becoming more relaxed and ready to enter the magical world of stories. Now, loosen your shoulders, gently massage your face, and release any remaining tension. Pay attention to any areas in your body that still feel tight. Maybe in your neck, back, or legs, and gently let them relax. Next, we'll do a short guided visualization. Imagine yourself in a beautiful garden under the night sky, with the soft moonlight shining down. You can hear the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the sound of water flowing gently in the distance. Feel the cool breeze brushing against your face. Now that your body and mind are relaxed, let's step into tonight's story. But before we begin, remind yourself that you deserve these moments of relaxation, and let go of all worries as you listen to each word. And now, as you are fully relaxed, let's begin our journey into tonight's tale. Allow my words to guide you into a world of dreams and serenity. Relax and listen slowly. Yo, you know that feeling when you finally ditch the concrete jungle? That's where our protagonist, let's call him Casey, was at. The tires on their ride were spitting back loose gravel, that satisfying crunch-crunch sound as they rolled off the blacktop. They'd peeled off the highway a good few minutes back, leaving the drone of the thruway behind. Now, this wasn't just some scenic route. This was a legit trek into the sticks. This skinny, winding lane swallowing them whole into the thick of the forest. Casey was on a mission, heading to this low-key bed and breakfast, the kind that promised to be way, way off the beaten path. And so far, it was delivering on that promise big time. Towering trees like these ancient, silent sentinels leaned in over the car, their branches twisting together overhead like some intricate, leafy canopy, practically blotting out the sky. Every now and then, a dark cloud would drift into view through a gap in the leaves, and Casey would watch it disappear behind a massive tree trunk, swallowed by the green. The road was a real wild card, turning this way and that, snaking in and out of the trees like it had a mind of its own. You couldn't see more than maybe 50 feet ahead before it veered off again, pulling you even deeper into the woods, making you wonder if you'd accidentally stumbled onto the set of some Blair Witch sequel. The directions Casey had printed out probably from some website that looked like it hadn't been updated since dial-up, said to just stick to this gravel track for a few miles. So they were taking it slow, no need to rush. This wasn't about hitting some deadline. It was about escaping them. They'd get there when they got there, not a minute sooner. Peeking through the windshield, Casey could see the trees swaying gently. A light breeze was kicking up. They hit the button and the window slid down a crack, letting in a blast of that real, unadulterated fresh air. Even that little sliver was enough to flood the car with this cool, crisp breeze, the kind that wakes you up from the inside out. It carried this incredible mix of smells, damp earth and pine needles, that earthy scent of moss, and the slightly sweet aroma of oak leaves. Casey leaned their head out a bit, just soaking it in, a smile spreading across their face as they navigated this solitary road. This was exactly the vibe they were chasing, a cozy hideaway, tucked deep in nature, a place to finally unplug and recharge that frazzled city brain. The road took a sharp left, then a lazy drift to the right, finally leading Casey to this small gravel parking area. It wasn't fancy, just enough space to squeeze in a few cars in front of what looked like a seriously humble bed and breakfast. But even from that first glance, Casey was digging the vibe. This wasn't some cookie-cutter hotel. This place had character. The exterior was all stacked, split logs, the real deal. A classic log cabin straight out of the storybook, or maybe a slightly less creepy version of that cabin from Evil Dead. It stood 2 stories tall, with these homey checkered curtains hanging in every window, giving it this warm, inviting feel. 2 big, bushy trees, practically overflowing with clusters of tiny red berries, loomed over it on either side, like protective guardians. And a short, slightly crooked fence enclosed a cute little garden in the back, hinting at some serious green thumb action during warmer months. Hanging next to the deep midnight blue front door was a hand-painted sign, the kind that tells you someone put their heart into this place. It showed the silhouette of a wolf throwing its head back and howling at this massive, glowing moon hanging low in the night sky. And right underneath, in slightly faded lettering, was the name, Lunar Lodge. Lunar Lodge, Casey whispered to themselves, letting the words roll off their tongues. It had a nice ring to it, almost romantic in a slightly spooky way. They could already picture themselves feeling right at home here for the next few days, far away from the sirens and the endless chatter of the city. Next to the door was one of those old-school round doorbell buttons. Casey gave it a gentle press and heard a faint, distant ring-a-ling echoing from inside. They waited a few moments, listening to the silence of the woods, but there was no answer. So they tried the bell again, a little firmer this time. Still, Lunar Lodge remained quiet, almost holding its breath. Taking a step back, Casey scanned the area, wondering if there was some kind of sign or a number to call to let the owner know they'd arrived. Just then, their eyes caught something. A thin, white envelope leaning against the bottom of the door frame, with their name printed clearly on the front. Casey picked it up, the paper feeling slightly damp from the forest air, and used their finger to slide open the flap. Inside was a folded note, written in this elegant, flowing script. "Welcome to Lunar Lodge," it read. "You'll find the key under the mat. Please come inside and make yourself at home. My apologies for not being here to greet you in person. I hope to meet you in the morning." It was signed simply, "The Owner." At the bottom, Casey noticed a hastily scribbled postscript. "P.S." The note continued. "It might be best to keep to your room tonight. I hope you'll find it cozy and to your liking." How strange, Casey thought to themselves, a little flicker of unease creeping in. But looking up at the sky, they saw these heavy, dark storm clouds starting to roll in, the kind that threatened a real downpour. "Maybe it's supposed to rain tonight, and he just wants to make sure I'm safe and dry inside," they reasoned, appreciating the owner's thoughtfulness and giving him a silent thanks before reaching under the welcome mat. Sure enough, right where he said it would be, was an old-fashioned brass key. Casey slid it into the lock and turned the knob. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a cozy little parlor that looked like it doubled as a breakfast nook. Right across from the entrance, there was this old wooden desk with a small stack of pamphlets neatly arranged on top. Casey idly flipped through them. There was a guide to the local plants and animals, a page with some recommendations for nature walks in the area, and this really worn-out almanac that listed the sunrise and sunset times for the whole year, along with the phases of the moon for every single month. It looked like something your grandma might have kept by the phone. Tucked in with the pamphlets was a second envelope, this one also addressed to Casey. Inside, they found a metal key attached to a cheap plastic keychain with the number 2 stamped on it. Looks like they'd be staying in room 2 on the second floor. Casey slipped the key into their pocket and continued to take in the entryway. To the right, there was this modest little setup of wooden tables and chairs. They all looked like they'd been roughly carved by hand and then polished to a warm sheen, giving the room this rustic, almost folk art feel. The air was thick with this heady scent of pine and sandalwood, the kind of smell that instantly made you think of those crisp, wintry evenings spent huddled by a fire in some hidden forest cabin, maybe with a mug of hot cocoa and a good book. The ceiling in this room was low, not so low that Casey had to duck, but you definitely felt its presence not too far above your head. But instead of feeling cramped, it actually made the room seem quaint and welcoming, like stepping into someone's cozy living room rather than some impersonal hotel lobby. This was definitely the kind of place that made you think of home, even if it wasn't your home. Right now, it seemed like Casey was the only guest in the whole place, which, honestly, was fine by them. More space, more privacy, exactly what the doctor ordered for this much-needed escape from the city chaos. They were really looking forward to a few days without the constant demands of everyday life. No looming deadlines, no endless work emails. Nothing to do but maybe curl up by a fireplace with a cup of hot tea and a good, trashy novel. With a small smile of anticipation, Casey hefted their bag and carried it over to the carpeted staircase that led to the second floor. Every other step seemed to groan under the weight, that familiar creak of old wood. But their footsteps were softened by the thick emerald green carpet that ran up the stairs. The interior of the lodge definitely had this timeless quality, like stepping into a photograph from another era. It was as if it had been frozen in time, tucked away in this little pocket of the forest, untouched by the relentless march of years. The wood-paneled walls seemed to amplify the sounds of their shoes on the floor and the rustling of their bag against their body. Paired with the thick carpet, it created this feeling of being enclosed and secure, like being in someone's private, well-loved home. Casey reached the second-floor landing and glanced around until their eyes landed on room number 2. Hanging on the door of room 2 was this charming little bundle of purple flowers. Casey had never seen this particular type of bloom used as a decoration before. Delicate, white-colored blossoms hung like tiny hoods in a column off a central stem, almost like miniature, elegant bells. The leaves of this spindly, fern-like plant were tucked into the gaps between the flowers, filling out the space and adding a touch of delicate green. It really is a beautiful display, Casey thought, appreciating the lovely, personal touch from the owner of Lunar Lodge. They pulled the key out of their pocket and went to insert it in the lock when something a little unusual caught their eye. The lock and the doorknob on their door were this gleaming brushed silver color, almost brand new looking. But all the other doors lining the hallway had standard brass knobs, which looked much older, probably original to the building. Maybe my door was being finicky and needed some new hardware, Casey mused, shrugging it off. Either way, the key slid smoothly into the lock. They pushed open the sturdy door, stepped inside their room, and let it close gently behind them. It wasn't just a room. It was a whole suite, it seemed. From the small entryway, Casey had the choice of going straight ahead or turning to the right. Straight ahead led to a pleasant little seating area, complete with these overstuffed couches that looked like they were begging to be sunk into. A cozy armchair pulled up next to a small inviting fireplace. To the right, an open doorway led to the bedroom, where an enormous bed, piled high with fluffy pillows and covered with a thick quilt, looked as soft as a cloud. On the bedside table, and again on the coffee table in the seating area sat a vase filled with the same distinctive bluish-purple flowers they'd seen on the door. They vaguely reminded Casey of lupines, the way the blossoms climbed up the stem, but they weren't quite the same shade of purple, and the shape of the flowers was a bit different. They stood in stark contrast to the heavy-looking furniture in the room. The coffee table, for instance, appeared to be made of wrought iron, with this gleaming silver top that looked surprisingly modern in this rustic setting. Turning around to get a different perspective of the room, Casey noticed a bundle of leaves hanging above the door they'd just come through. Moving closer, they saw it was a bunch of mistletoe dangling upside down, its stems tied together with a delicate silver ribbon. Tiny, pearly white berries dotted the bright green leaves like little frozen raindrops. What a strange decoration for a room in autumn, Casey thought, a little puzzled. But still, they liked how it added a splash of color to the entryway, so they decided to leave it there for now. They set their bag down near the door, figuring they'd unpack later. Right now, they were itching to do a little exploring of the lodge itself. From their bag, they pulled out their jacket, a warm beanie, and a cozy scarf, just in case they decided to venture outside later. They imagined it probably got pretty chilly at night out here in the middle of the forest. With their key safely tucked in their pocket, and one last glance around the welcoming suite, Casey headed back out into the hallway. Instead of going straight back to the landing and down the stairs, they decided to take a quick look around on the second floor. A few other doors lined the hall, but none of them looked like they were currently in use. Like other bed and breakfasts Casey had stayed in before, this one had a few quirky aesthetic touches that hinted at the owner's unique personality. And despite being an older building, it was impeccably clean and neat. At the end of the hall, there was this waist-high glass table holding another bunch of those same purple flowers and their lacy green leaves arranged in a simple glass vase. And along the upper edge of the wall, just above the tops of the door frames, ran a wallpaper border. On it was a repeating pattern. The silhouette of a wolf throwing its head back and howling at a bright, full moon. It matches the sign on the front of the building, Casey realized. Seems like a fitting image for a lodge tucked away in the woods. Turning back towards the stairs, they made their way down to the first floor. But instead of going back into the breakfast nook, Casey walked around the back of the staircase into a large, comfortable-looking sitting room. They imagined this was where guests could come and relax together on an evening like this one. Maybe playing board games, sipping hot tea, just gazing at a crackling fire in the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. But since Casey seemed to be the only guest, and the owner was nowhere to be seen, the fireplace was dark and cold. It would be quite pretty with a fire going, Casey thought, picturing the warm flames reflecting off the cranberry-red walls and the deep emerald carpet. Above the fireplace was a solid wooden mantelpiece. In the center, Casey found another bouquet of those same purple flowers in a clear glass vase. It was nestled between two bundles of mistletoe and an assortment of those delicate, lacy leaves. Above the mantel, a wide painting hung on the wall. But instead of being a traditional family portrait or a tranquil landscape scene, this was an oil painting of a bright, full moon hanging low in the sky above the same kind of tall, slender trees that stood outside the lodge. I wonder if the owner is a botanist, or just really fascinated by flowers, plants, and trees, Casey mused, noticing the recurring floral and botanical motifs throughout the lodge. As they were about to step back from the fireplace, something on the floor caught their eye. Bending down, Casey saw that it was a small tuft of dark, grayish-black fur. They thought the owner didn't mention having a dog, they thought. Maybe a stray just wandered in for a bit. Standing back up, Casey returned to the front desk. They remembered seeing a pamphlet about local plants and animals and wanted to see if it mentioned the name of those unusual purple flowers. It didn't take long to locate the folded informational booklet on the desk. Opening it up, Casey traced their fingertips down the page, scanning for any mention of distinctive flowers and leaves. Not finding anything that matched the purple blooms or the fern-like foliage, they flipped the pamphlet over to check the other side. There, right along the fold, was a picture of the purple flowers. The caption underneath read, "Canitum, commonly known as monk's hood, blue rocket, or wolfsbane." How curious, Casey thought to themselves, a little shiver running down their spine. They'd heard of wolfsbane before, mostly in old stories and movies, but they'd never actually seen it, let alone seen it used as a decoration inside a building. Casey quickly scanned the rest of the page, searching for any mention of the leafy plant that was mixed in with the wolfsbane on the door and in the vases around the lodge. But there wasn't anything resembling it to be found in the pamphlet. Setting aside the booklet, Casey walked over to the breakfast nook. There, on the back wall, was a tall bookshelf filled with old-looking books. Some were bound in worn leather, while others had tattered fabric bindings, their spines faded and cracked with age. Scanning the shelves, Casey soon found a volume that seemed promising. A thick book with a weathered green cover titled Local Plant Lore. The cover had definitely seen better days, but all the pages seemed to be intact. Casey carefully pulled the book from the shelf, inhaling deeply the comforting scent of musty, old paper as they opened it. Turning the pages one by one, they soon came to the section they were looking for. About a quarter of the way through the book, they found a detailed illustration of the leafy plant. The caption underneath identified it as Artemisia, or common wormwood. Further down the page was a sketch of mistletoe hanging in a bundle, looking remarkably similar to the decoration above their door. And next to it was a drawing of a mountain ash tree, also known as rowan, with its distinctive clusters of bright red berries standing beside a quaint little house. Below that, with a section on the lore and traditional uses of these plants was supposed to be, the bottom half of the page was torn away. Only a jagged, tattered edge of old paper remained. With a sigh of slight disappointment, Casey carefully placed the book back on the shelf. Guess I'll have to look that up online when I get back to the city, they thought. Just then, a yawn bubbled up from deep within their chest. They stretched their arms out wide and blinked slowly, feeling the weariness of the long drive finally catching up to them. It was nearing bedtime, and they were definitely ready to hit the hay. But before heading off to sleep, there was one more thing they wanted to do. They remembered seeing a garden behind the lodge, and, even if it was just for a few minutes, they wanted to step outside, get some fresh air, and take a quick stroll around before climbing into bed. They were glad they'd remembered to bring their jacket, scarf, and hat. Slipping them on, Casey opened the front door of Lunar Lodge and stepped out into the brisk night air. The sky overhead was a deep, inky black, completely overcast. Only a few faint stars managed to twinkle through the gaps in the thin, wispy clouds that drifted across the night. Taking a deep breath, Casey felt the cool, crisp air fill their lungs. When they breathed out, it condensed into the slightest hint of fog in the cool night air. The first frost must be coming soon to this part of the forest, they thought, pulling their gloved hands deeper into their pockets for warmth. They walked around the side of the lodge, the gravel crunching softly under their boots, until they reached the gate to the back garden. It was only about knee height and looked more like a decorative element than a real barrier. Casey lifted the simple latch and stepped inside the garden. Even in the darkness, they could tell this place must have been beautiful in the summer. They could make out the faint outlines of leafy bushes and tangled vines, their summer glory now faded. All that remained were the bare, skeletal tendrils and stems of autumn, the plants preparing for the long, cold winter months ahead. I've come here during a time of change and transformation, Casey mused, a sudden thought striking them. The tall pine trees surrounding the garden rustled gently in the breeze, as if in silent agreement. And then Casey noticed a subtle shift in the light. The garden had been shrouded in a deep darkness beneath the heavy, overcast sky. But now it was slowly being illuminated in shades of soft silver and pale gold. Looking up, Casey saw that the clouds had begun to part, revealing an enormous, luminous full moon hanging low and heavy in the sky, its light casting long, eerie shadows across the garden. As the final wisp of cloud drifted away from the moon's bright edge, A long, echoing call pierced the stillness of the woods. It was a howl, deep and resonant, unlike any Casey had ever heard before. The sound of it sent a shiver down their spine, making the hairs on their arms stand on end. For some reason, at that precise moment, the scribbled words at the bottom of the lodge owner's note flashed into Casey's mind. It might be best to keep to your room tonight. They weren't entirely sure why, but a primal part of them felt like they understood the owner's meaning now, a sense of unease settling in their stomach. Without a second glance at the dark woods surrounding the garden, Casey turned quickly and made their way back towards the warm glow of Lunar Lodge. They walked around the front desk and up the carpeted stairs to the second-floor landing, their footsteps feeling heavier than before. Fishing the key out of their pocket, their fingers slightly trembling, Casey inserted it into the cool silver lock and then turned the gleaming silver doorknob. The heavy wooden door of room 2 closed securely behind them with a reassuring thud. All around the cozy suite, the distinctive purple flowers, the wolfsbane, stood in their vases, their hooded blossoms seeming to watch Casey with an almost knowing air. Here, within the familiar comfort of their own space, Casey felt their body begin to slowly relax, the tension in their shoulders easing. Their mind, which had been racing with questions and a growing sense of unease, started to clear, like the parting clouds they had just witnessed in the night sky. They took off their jacket and scarf, hanging them neatly in the small closet, and changed into a pair of soft, familiar pajamas, the cotton feeling comforting against their skin. Then they turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into a soft darkness, and climbed into the large, fluffy bed. It was situated against a wall with a window right above the headboard. Looking out through the glass, Casey could see a few stubborn stars still twinkling overhead, their light faint but persistent. The wind rustled the branches of the trees outside, their silhouettes casting long, dancing shadows on the curtains of their window. Casey yawned deeply, the exhaustion of the day finally overwhelming them, and closed their eyes. Almost immediately, they began to drift off to sleep, their mind a swirling mix of images. Transformations in the moonlight, those strange purple flowers, a fleeting glimpse of dark fur, and the haunting glow of the full moon hanging low in a dark, silent night sky. In their dreams, the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the trees, and the howl echoed again, closer this time, carrying a message that Casey couldn't quite decipher but felt deep in their bones. The forest held its breath, waiting, and Casey, nestled in the unfamiliar comfort of Lunar Lodge, dreamt of wolves and moonlit gardens, of ancient lore and the subtle, unsettling magic that seemed to permeate this secluded place.